God kväll, good evening, guten Abend, dobry wieczór, labvakar, and just learning it in Latvian, dear guests to this auditorium and also to those watching online. My name is Katarina Siachi-Åspring and I will guide you through this full evening that will touch upon issues such as press freedom, threats, disinformation, radio resilience, and increasing risks for journalists. The title of the evening, Defending Press Freedom in Times of War and Crisis. A very, very topical issue. There will be some space and time for questions from the audience at the end, but we also hope that many of you will stay along and grab some delicious Ukrainian food afterwards, which is waiting for you, and continuing the discussions. And I would like to kick off by introducing the Swedish ambassador, Veronika Wand-Danielsson.
Tack, Katarina. Wir sind in Berlin, wir fangen ein bisschen auf Deutsch an, auf jeden Fall das Begrüßungswort. Herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, zum nordischen Felleshaus, schwedische Botschaft, organisiert jetzt dieses Event heute. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, and a special warm welcome to all the representatives of the media that are here joining us today. I'm very happy to welcome you tonight to Felleshus, the common house, that's the word, Felleshus, of the Nordic embassies in Berlin. Tonight, on the eve of the World Press Freedom Day 2024, we have in a joint Nordic, Baltic, Ukrainian, American endeavor gathered to discuss how to defend press freedom in crisis of war, as Katarina just said, with a special emphasis on the consequences of Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine. Sweden celebrates this year 258 years of our constitutional Act on Freedom of the Press and Access to Information. The first ever, indeed, in the world. It all started with a pamphlet by a Swedish-Finnish priest who was convinced that as all people are created equal, it was important to protect the weak against the rich and powerful. He also considered it crucial that everyone should be able to influence society and therefore influence politics. His view, in those days, considered as revolutionary, was that openness, access to information, and public discussion were the very basis of a better society. These ideas gained traction and eventually resulted in this radical law adopted already in 1766. Sweden's view even today on the principles of transparency, accountability, or openness is based on the content of this important law. Ladies and gentlemen, we have most distinguished guests here tonight. I'm particularly happy to welcome Cilla Benke, that for over a decade has been the Director General and CEO of Sveriges Radio, the Swedish public service radio, and since last year also Vice President of the European Broadcasting Union. Cilla is not the least a passionate leader and a promoter of press freedom wherever she comes across it. She has also been rewarded for her work on gender equality in Sveriges Radio and has received the highest distinction you can get in Sweden, the King's Medal, for outstanding achievements in the Swedish media industry. Warmly welcome to Berlin, and you have the floor. And thank you for being here, Cilla.
Well, thank you very much. Vielen Dank. First of all, thank you, the Swedish Embassy and Ambassador, for inviting me here to Berlin today to speak ahead of the World Press Freedom Day that you all know is tomorrow, on a subject that absolutely is very close to my heart and has been so my entire career. Because we're all experiencing very worrying times with rapid and profound changes going on in the world. We have a war going on in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. And globally, we see a democratic decline in very many countries, also in Europe. Only roughly 30% of the world's population now live in a liberal democracy, and that is a rapid change over the last 10 years. One of these countries where there is a sharp decline is, of course, Russia, where media freedom has been strangled almost entirely since the invasion of Ukraine. The Russian Duma has criminalized factual reporting. International correspondents have been arrested, accused of espionage or of being foreign agents, and the Kremlin has blocked access to trustworthy and independent media outlets. The Russian population, but also actually the rest of the world, have basically been robbed of the right to information. And meanwhile, we are experiencing the biggest assault on truth and democracy of our time. An information warfare is also taking place, mainly in the digital landscape. And generative AI has, while offering new and very exciting opportunities, also led to new and almost endless possibilities for those who wish to create chaos or instability by spreading propaganda and disinformation. And personally, I'm very convinced that the need for strong and independent media has never been greater, and that journalism has a big and important role to play. Because we all need professional and impartial journalists who can be our eyes and who can be our ears on the ground. We need reporting and we need information that we can trust. This is extremely important, and it's extremely important if you want to counter disinformation. For the sake of a democracy and a society, we need journalists that can keep holding power to account and unveil injustices, especially in a time of crisis. My colleague, Mikola, from the public service broadcaster Suspilne in Ukraine, he will be joining us shortly. He can confirm what I'm saying, and this with absolute clarity. I'm just actually back from visiting him in Ukraine. We made a trip around the country, and I got to see firsthand what independent and trustworthy journalism really brings to a society. In difficult times, the importance cannot be overstated. The last decade has been challenging for the media sector in many other ways, to say the least. Financial competition from global tech giants, we all heard about that, endless budget cuts, failing ad revenues, rising energy prices, and inflation has taken its toll. And meanwhile, media organizations and journalists have become a target for actors trying to steer the narrative. For instance, when a government is trying to take control of a public service, as we have seen in Slovakia only this spring. Another is journalists being pointed out as the enemy, as being biased, as being part of an elite. So we all must see and educate ourselves on the purposes behind these attacks. Anyone who succeeds in devaluating trust in independent media has an easier time influencing the country from the outside. That's the fact. On an individual level, the number of threats aimed at journalists have significantly increased the last decade, and I know that also in this country, hostility and attacks towards journalism has become a bigger problem than it used to be. Also in Sweden, a country we just heard, with high trust in the media and with the oldest media freedom law in the world, we have seen substantial increases of threats and hate speech, mainly online. Journalists are being targeted and harassed in various ways. Even I, as a Director General of a public service company, from time to time need personal protection, full time, every day, 24/7. And this was not the case for my predecessors. So something has changed. It's important to be aware of this development and to know that there will be consequences. There are signs that indicate that some journalists avoid certain topics because they have a fear of being threatened or subject to hate speech. But there are, of course, also journalists that are in more acute danger today, putting their lives on the line every day so that we can get vital information on what's going on in the world, like right now in Kharkiv, for instance, or in Gaza. In the wars in Ukraine and between Hamas and Israel, we see devastating losses of lives. Children die, families die, civilians and aid workers. But the last year has also been the deadliest in these countries for journalists in modern time. despite the fact that international law stipulates protection for journalists and civilians in conflicts. It is therefore critical that crimes against journalists are being investigated, prosecuted, and punished. Unfortunately, that's not the case today. According to UNESCO, only 1 out of 10 cases when a journalist gets killed is solved and someone do get sentenced and punished. So, I'm looking forward to continue this very, very important discussion on media freedom with all of you here tonight. We will have open questions, if I understand it correctly, and to share these challenges, but hopefully also some possible solutions. That would be nice. The topic concerns all of us wishing to live in a well-functioning democracy. Preserving and strengthening media freedom therefore lies on all our shoulders. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cecilia Becker, for this helicopter overview of the current challenging situation. In any discussion, getting the facts right is very crucial, and when it comes to press freedom, the compilation done by Reporters Without Borders is of great value to anybody following these issues, and we're therefore very honored here tonight to have the executive officer of Reporters Without Borders Germany, Anja Osterhaus, with us, who is going to tell us something about the current trends and development globally when it comes to press freedom. Please, Anja.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me tonight in this important event at the eve of World Press Freedom Day. At Reporters Without Borders, press freedom is our daily business. Tomorrow we will launch our annual index, rating the level of press freedom in 100 countries across the world. I cannot share any details at this stage, it's only tomorrow, but one news is clear: unfortunately, the situation of press freedom is deteriorating around the world. As you all know, journalists, and we heard already, journalists are under pressure in many countries, and for many different reasons. War is one of them. Clearly, any journalist living and working in a country at war faces significant security threats, and we shall hear more about that tonight, I suppose. But unfortunately, war is not the only risk. From Mexico and Mali to Myanmar, they are under pressure if they intend to speak or write the truth, and if this truth does not please those in power. Whether governments or businesses, drug cartels or mafia. Last year, 45 journalists lost their lives in the course of their work. 84 went missing and 54 were kidnapped. 521 journalists were in prison. The most dangerous places for journalists are Mexico, Afghanistan, and, of course, Palestine. Since the brutal attack by Hamas last October, more than 100 journalists were killed by the massive bombardments in Gaza. 26 of them lost their lives in the course of their work. And still, Palestinian journalists and bloggers continue to work out of Gaza under incredible conditions. Almost all of them lost their homes. Their offices are destroyed. There are frequent electricity cuts and internet connection is very unstable. But given that international media cannot enter the Gaza Strip, they are the only source of information we have. Through our partners, Reporters Without Borders provides journalists in Gaza with life-saving material and equipment to help them to continue this important work. Gaza is clearly one of the most difficult places for journalists today. Every single journalist who resists the pressure and continues to work under such conditions, whether in Gaza, Myanmar, Belarus, Iran, Afghanistan, deserves our greatest respect. But I would also like to touch upon another important dimension of our work which is central to tonight's discussion. Even in countries with a good level of press freedom, as we already heard tonight, we increasingly face the challenges of disinformation. the lines between real and fake news are increasingly blurred. We know that election campaigns have been significantly influenced through one-sided information or even propaganda disguised as facts. Also, this challenge is particularly great in times of war, but it goes far beyond and is very widespread today. Just one out of many examples, and I have an example from Slovakia, but it could be from so many places. Recently, a fake audio tape about journalist Monika Todova and the chairman of the Progressive Slovakia Party appeared, pretending they were preparing electoral fraud. It was before the elections last fall. It was just 2 days ahead of these elections. The fake audio tape reached tens of thousands of people, and the journalist received hate messages from people who believed the fake audio was true. The main intention clearly was to shed a bad light on the political party, but it also attacked a well-known investigative journalist. We see disinformation everywhere, and it is particularly successful in places with rather weak media institutions and low trust in state institutions. Both lack of press freedom and disinformation place huge risks on our democratic societies. It is very important to address these challenges, and Reporters Without Borders has developed some recommendations in this respect. We are working on these, and I would like to share some of our thoughts right now. Today, propaganda media are profiting from advertising revenue that comes from global brands and Western European companies. This is really problematic, and we need to find ways to defund the business of disinformation. We also need to support these individuals, the journalists and the independent media outlets in countries with limited press freedom. As Reporters Without Borders, we do provide such support, both financially and technically, and we also help them with digital security trainings, but much more is needed. And the third recommendation I would like to share is journalists who fled from countries with little or no media freedom should be supported in their efforts to continue working from exile. Otherwise, there won't be anybody left within the countries and not anybody left outside of the countries to unmask the propaganda, to provide people in these countries with independent information. And last but not least, we need to ensure high standards of professional journalism within our own countries. With this in mind, Reporters Without Borders developed the so-called Journalism Trust Initiative, a standard that defines principles of professional journalism. Over 250 media companies have already joined this initiative, which is very important to continue having professional journalism in our countries. Finally, please allow me to share a few personal words about Ukraine, which is tonight's focus of the discussion. And actually, it was also the focus of our photo book. We publish a photo book, and last year was about Ukraine. So if you are interested, we will have some on the first floor later on. Last year, I visited Ukraine. I saw the destruction and the suffering of people affected by the Russian aggression. And I still feel it today. We see it basically every day in the news. The Oscar-winning film 24 Days in Mariupol has shown the world how important it is that journalists provide information and images, thus giving evidence of war crimes and the suffering created by aggressors such as Putin's army. So I want to say it again. These journalists deserve our greatest respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that all of us will stay tuned tomorrow when the new Press Freedom Index ranking is being released, Anja. So after this sober health check on the status of global press freedom, we are now going to connect, I hope, with the beautiful and proud capital, Kiev, where we have Mykola Chernotitsky, who is the head of the managing board, which is a kind of CEO-like role, of Suspilne, which is the public service broadcasting company of Ukraine. Добрий вечір, Mykola. Ласкаво просимо віртуально до Felleshuset Berlin. Good evening. It's so great. We were expecting you here personally tonight, but circumstances came in between, and we are extremely happy to have you here online with us. And before I will ask you a few questions, I'm thinking that for those of you in the audience who have no idea what Суспільне is about, Суспільне means public in Ukrainian, we have a short film about your organization. So let's have a look at that one first.
Суспільне Ukraine, an independent media company with huge national coverage on television, radio and digital media. Round-the-clock news trusted by 84% of our audience. Country's largest network of local journalists. Over 10 million subscriptions on social media platforms, both national and local. Major projects in 2023. History documentaries that help revisit the past to avoid mistakes in the future. Projects about people who are fighting for Ukraine and have chosen the path of freedom, whose unbreakable spirit is admired by the whole world. Documentaries about those who are upholding human rights. Investigations of Russia's war crimes. Projects about the scars of the war. The horrors Ukrainians face every day. We keep unique records. We spread the word about our culture, from legendary Smervichka and radio hits of the past to trendy comic strips and modern artists. We unite Ukrainians all over the world around our language, songs, and sports. We keep laughing to carry on and stay optimistic. We care about our youngest, helping them to feel safe and be brave. We thank you for your help and appreciation of our work. Defending freedoms in Ukraine. Суспільне Ukraine.
Thank you. We do deserve a big round of applause.
At 6:30 we started with broadcast. At the same time we established contact with our regional branches to make sense of the situation, because Russia started to invite for the different direction, Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, and we need to understand what happens here.
And actually the issue that you were touching upon a little bit in terms of not revealing the number of casualties, I mean, how do you make sure that you do not unwillingly, of course, harm the war effort by providing information that, so to say, would help Putin?
Look, first of all, we need to understand, we need to check information. We need to, we don't chase the hype, I think. We need to check, we public responsible, we're responsible for our society. So, if we check and we understand it's true, and for example, I try to maybe talk about case. For example, sometimes running after sensation, some report about death before the person family knew about that. And it's very traumatic experience. for the family. So in this case, you need to think about that. You need and understand your consequences of what you will do. So I think it's natural that you understand your citizenship of your steps and you don't chase the hype.
Дякую. Thank you so much, Mikola. Please stay with us. We will have some more questions to you, but I would like, as I remember the 24th of February, and of course, as everybody in this room, and I know that a lot of people in Sweden actually turned on the radio and turned on Sveriges Radio, Swedish radio. We talked also in this little film with Mikola also about the trust levels also being very high. Do people in Sweden trust Sveriges Radio?
They certainly do, and actually more and more, which is important to recognize, because sometimes when you listen to the debate, you think that the trust in traditional media and in public service is going downwards. At least in Sweden, that's not the case, luckily. And I think what you mentioned has something to do with it. Swedish Radio has the largest network of foreign correspondents of all Nordic media. We also have the largest presence locally of all national media. And that's how we build the trust, in being very, very close to our audience, leaving the buildings, being very much present in their daily life, and being very, very fast on reporting, not telling people what to think, but reporting, putting things into perspective, giving them the facts, and then they can make their own decision. And I think the 24th of February was a very good example, because we normally have very high figures of reach. But that morning we started a 48-hour-long broadcast in P1, which is a channel which has speech only, no music. We got 500,000 new listeners.
500,000?
500,000 in the country with 10 million people.
Yes.
And these 500,000 didn't come from another Swedish radio channel, because they didn't lose any audience. And they didn't come from commercial radio either. They just came. And they came because they wanted help to understand what's going on. And they wanted it from a trustworthy source of information. So I'm very, very proud of the way we do deal with these big things, and the way the audience is reacting to it. Also the young audiences. We see an increase right now in the age group 20 plus, listening to traditional linear radio. You think that they're only listening to podcasts. That's not the case in Sweden. They're tuning in ordinary linear radio, also to this P1, without any music, because there is so much going on, and they also want to understand. Because also young people want to understand and make up their own decision. And as long as you stick to it, that you don't tell people what to think and do, but give them the facts, give them the voices, being very close to the community, being very much out there, giving them stories where they could recognize themselves, they do come.
So it's not only TikTok. I think that's very encouraging.
It's not only TikTok, but we're present on TikTok as well.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the special role of radio, because we talked to Mikola here, and we also heard about, all the challenges in times of crisis and war. We also know that you have a special emergency response mission within the Swedish total defense, which is the defense which includes both the military defense and also the civil part of it. Can you tell us a little bit more about this mission?
Well, I agree with Mikola that, of course, you could see that people were tuning in, going into social media to get fast information. But still, to be able to get that fast information, you need a device that is very much dependent on electricity. And we also see that there is no electricity. And you don't need to have a war. If you go and ask UN, they predict that we will have 560 natural disasters in the world per year from 2030 and onwards. 560. Most likely some of them will hit Germany. Some of them will definitely hit Sweden. And then there is no electricity. The mobile phones will not work. And you saw this in 2021 in this country, where people lost their lives and they lost their homes, and the only way that you could communicate was through radio. And I know that television people hate me for saying this, and also newspaper people hate me for saying this, because we all want to think that the digital is the thing, but the digital is only the thing as long as there is electricity and a mobile phone system that is working. Otherwise it's radio. Terrestrial radio works because you can broadcast without electricity, and you can have a radio receiver that don't needs to be loaded all the time. And that gives us an advantage and gives us a very special role when it comes to the Swedish civil defense.
Absolutely, and including, I guess, also some geolocation challenges that also happens with other medias and so forth. You mentioned in the beginning that you just visited Ukraine. You went not only to Kiev, but to many other cities. You met with Mykola, right? And I think we have some photos here of your recent visit from Ukraine. What takeaways or conclusions can you share from this trip? And what can countries like Sweden, like Germany, learn from the Ukrainian experiences?
Well, you can learn a lot, and I strongly encourage you to go and not just sit and think that you know what's going on, because you don't know until you're there. And of course, there are a lot of things that I took back, and Nicola, as you see here on the photo, patiently showed me around, and I took a lot of his time, which he didn't have time for, but thank you so much, Nicola. But one thing, of course, you can never forget the people. I mean, you meet these people, and as you said, they're on their third year of a war. You don't know where the bombs are going to hit. You don't know if they're going to hit you, your home, your family, your loved ones. You have no clue if it's going to be today, tomorrow, the next week, or 3 weeks from now. You don't know if it's going to be in the morning, during the daytime, or in the evening. But you need to know all the time, where do you have a shelter?
So your prime audience, you actually have the Russian-speaking audience in the Baltic states, but then you also have Russians inside of Russia. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. Our primary audience are Russians living in Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Not only Russians, but those who speak Russian, because Baltic states in this regard are quite multilingual. The average citizen in Latvia speaks Russian, Latvian, English. So basically, but we see from our statistics that we've been viewed also in Russia through YouTube, through VPNs, and that's the way how we work through unbiased and uncensored and accurate information that we try to provide for audience who's outside of Baltic states. Exactly.
О том, как вольно обращается Кремль с понятием терроризм, говорит пример движения «Талибан».
Хорошие, нормальные люди, которые, естественно, американцев выгоняли из Афганистана, талибы не исключают и подают сигналы, что готовы помочь России в борьбе с украинским терроризмом.
Абсолютное большинство стран-членов ООН, в том числе и Россия, признало Талибан террористической организацией. Тем не менее, ее представители регулярно наведываются в Москву на экономические форумы, выставки. В ближайшее время талибы собираются приехать в Казань, поговорить о проблемах Афганистана. Все последние месяцы российская дипломатия то и дело анонсирует возможное решение пересмотреть статус талибов и больше не считать их террористами.
Закономерно, что и неонацистский киевский режим перешел к террористическим методам.
С началом полномасштабной войны главным террористом Кремль окончательно объявил Украину.
Мы должны уничтожить террористическое государство Украины. Вот и все.
Каленым железом, огнем и мечом. Эти террористы должны быть уничтожены.
Терроризмом в прокремлевских СМИ называют не только обстрелы сооружений двойного назначения, например, мосты, НПЗ, снабжающие топливом боевую технику, но и удары по российским военным объектам, аэродромам и базам. Хотя кремлевская пропаганда упорно говорит о террористическом режиме в Киеве, именно в адрес России все чаще выдвигаются обвинения в поддержке террора. Государством-спонсором терроризма Россию признали Латвия, Литва и Эстония. Польша, Чехия, Словакия, Нидерланды, Украина, парламентские ассамблеи ОБСЕ, Совета Европы, Европарламент и парламентская ассамблея стран НАТО.
And Oscars, for obvious reasons, you're not very popular with the Russian regime, to say the least. And actually, it's also not without risks for people within Russia to like your footage. Can you tell us?
Yeah, I fully agree with you. Unlike Riga office, where journalists can feel safe and free and they can dedicate their efforts to the job, in Russia, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has been labeled as unwelcomed organization quite recently, in quite a few weeks ago. Basically, what does it mean? Our TV, you can watch it online through Current Time TV website, through YouTube channel, wherever. Different internet platforms. It's not prohibited by the law in Russia. Nevertheless, if our audience, somebody in Russia, will press button like, will share the content, will write comment under this, it's by authorities it's interpreted as supporting unwelcomed media, and it can entail administrative and criminal offense. So it means that if somebody will like this story over the internet, he or she can be punished by 15,000 Russian rubles, which is equivalent to 150 euros. If such things will repeat, this person can be a subject to criminal offense and can spend some time in penitentiary. To those organizations, for example, Reporters Sans Frontières, who has supported us in efforts to free them. And I just want to mention that last week, European Parliament, they adopted a resolution on where they applied to Russian authorities and asked it to free journalists who are in detention, including also and also foreign journalists.
But this one visit of the polling station in the morning and us moving around in this Lugansk town, half destroyed, in a very bad state. There's only edge internet, no 3G, so you're not even able to send a WhatsApp message or something like that. Got us enormous problems. Later on we were sent to our hotel. We were not allowed anymore to film anything. Security service guys were on our floor, so we couldn't really leave this room. In the end, I was allowed to do a stand-up on the main square. They even organized some people with paper in my back, something in strange German, Ukrainians are all terrorists. So it was like the full propaganda program, the full propaganda playbook that they used at that time. Luckily, I had organized in advance some contacts from people outside of this territory who were able to help us to get out, but this was really a very difficult situation, and it shows how quickly, and it's also the reason now we're talking about the other occupied territories, we get a few information from people who are risking their lives to bring this information out. But this is the reason why we don't know anything or heard very few things, because information space is so much controlled. And
we know that Russia invests enormous amounts, I mean billions of dollars, in disinformation or in manipulation of information as part of their hybrid operations. And I mean, you are the prime target. How do you work with that? Are you a believer in suspilne of debunking, which means that you, so to say, reveal the disinformation as soon as possible, or the famous pre-bunking, which can be explained perhaps that you try to, so to say, inoculate your audience to be more resilient against disinformations? How do you work in suspilne?
Working against propaganda, it's really complicated issues, really. But we have both way. For us, for example, very important develop critical thinking and verified facts, etc., etc. So if you give information what you verified, your audience know about it. You have a big level of trust. So and people understand what. Okay, I saw this information. I need to check. And okay, I check it to Sweden because we know time to time some on the focus group where the people say if Suspilna said about that, it's true. So it's like evaluation of our job. But in other way, we produce. I'm not sure what it can call propaganda. It's more about how Russia used information during the war. Especially, for example, how Russia used culture, how Russia used sport, etc., etc. So it's about good storytelling.
Thank you so much. You would like to add something?
Yeah, I think you also told us a very interesting story, Mikla, when you were there and we talked to your head of news, that she said that disinformation is often so badly done, so that's sort of easy to spot. But that the tricky thing right now is manipulated news, where the substance is actually true. And then it's being built into a much bigger story. And she told us about, for instance, that there are high-ranking people within Ukraine that might have a son who is studying in London and therefore is not in the war. Then it becomes not only one son who is in London, but then it becomes a story that the entire elite of Ukraine don't have any of their children joining the army. And so they take kind of something that is true and build a story around it, and that's much harder to detect.
That was the moment that we understood also as foreign.
Ago in Kabul, Afghanistan. Here we see a photo of Nils. And actually, if you could tell us a little bit about Nils and also about, you were pretty new in your role.
To our own countries in Europe, basically Germany, Sweden. So, I mean, I really want to acknowledge that we are in a very good place in Europe overall related to press freedom. If we listen to what we just heard, I mean, every year when we publish our index on press freedom, we just find that European countries are at the top, and that is a very good place to be. Even though there is variation, of course, and we can improve things in our countries as well, I think what we need to acknowledge first is that we have achieved a lot and we are in a good place, and that this good place needs to be protected and acknowledged, but also protected. We see so many countries where it's going down, so what can we do to avoid that in our countries? I think that's the first important, that's the most important point about Europe. It's more rather at the top of our list, even though we have countries where we are very concerned, like Hungary, for example, now Slovakia, even Italy. You may have heard that there's even been some censorship in Italy. I mean, that's new trends as well in Europe, that we have in countries like Italy these kinds of problems. We have media concentration sometimes in France, for example, where media, like a few very rich individuals own basically most of the media in the country and have influence on that, and if we are unlucky, it's right-wing, very right-wing, extreme right influence. So we do have challenges. We also have challenges in Germany, and we certainly have challenges in Sweden. I have to say I'm not an expert in Sweden, so we really look very much into the cases where the problems are. One thing I really want to say as well is that it will help us to protect the situation where we are. The fact that there's European legislation currently, I mean, it has actually been approved, the European Media Freedom Act, and particularly because we have trends in countries, like we used to have a very difficult trend in Poland, which now changed with the new government, but how to make sure that what we have achieved will stay. European legislation can really be helpful for European countries, European Union member states, and for countries like Ukraine, where we see improvements because of the interest to join the EU. So I think we shouldn't underestimate also the relevance of the European dimension and the relevance of going to the polls in June, because we really need to protect these places and spaces for European citizens while we also should try and continue to support people working in much more difficult situations than us.
Since you look to me, Madam Ambassador, I'm sad to say, last session was an overview over the 18th century, Sweden's descent and Russia's rise.
They are spreading the disinformation. Thank you.
I have no easy answer. ARD, my company, is mostly using the term Angriffskrieg gegen die Ukraine, which is the translation of Russia's aggression war against Ukraine. My perception in the population is that it doesn't change a lot. People are talking in Germany mostly about Ukraine war. Comparing to other wars, I didn't prepare for that question, but in 2003 we also said Iraq war. So mostly wars have been named after the region where it takes place and not after the person, the country that started the war. Although I acknowledge the fact that language does a lot for the perception of the war. What definitely is a no-go in my opinion is sometimes I still hear Ukraine conflict. We are way above conflict already for lots of time, so we have to remember sometimes that from 2014 till 2022, 13,000 people died in this war in eastern Ukraine, and people were still calling it a conflict. Also, this was not correct. So I think we can forget about Ukraine conflict, but with war, I prefer to use verbal phrases like Russia attacked Ukraine, for example, in order to explain it in a better way, or the full-scale attack, something like that. Just some sort of small words that we all use all the time. I think in the end, in the audience has the impression that they need to learn a vocabulary now, and it doesn't help in understanding what's really going on. But it's my personal opinion. I support your point, but I see also problematic aspects with just concentrating on the phrase.
Thank you all, dear audience, but I also want to thank really from the bottom of my heart.